Thank you, Pascal, and welcome. What a day. We've all made it out here in the windy weather in Miami. It's an absolute delight for me to introduce to you today two remarkable women and authors who will have a discussion on Judith Rodin's newest novel, The Resilience Dividend. Judith is president of the Rockefeller Foundation, one of the world's leading philanthropic organizations, and a generous supporter of the book fair, for which we are incredibly grateful. She was previously the president of the University of Pennsylvania and the provost of Yale University. Dr. Rodin has actively participated in influential global forums, including the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Clinton Global Initiative, and the United Nations General Assembly. In 2012, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo named Dr. Rodin to co-chair New York State 2100 Commission on Long-Term Resilience following Superstorm Sandy. A pioneer and innovator throughout her career, Dr. Rodin was the first woman named to lead an Ivy League institution and is the first woman to serve as the Rockefeller Foundation's president. She is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and earned a PhD in psychology from Columbia University. Dr. Rodin is the author of more than 200 academic articles and has written or co-written 12 books. The Resilience Dividend, Being Strong in a World Where Things Go Wrong, is Dr. Rodin's latest book. From cyber attacks to food shortage crisis to extreme volatility in energy prices, we can no longer assume that we are immune to the world's wicked problems, no matter where we live. We face extreme weather events, rapid population shifts, and global interconnectedness that make us vulnerable to the world's problems in new and increasingly challenging ways. The Resilience Dividend develops both a way of thinking and practical tools for taking action to protect the world's people and communities, and shows us how to create a blueprint for change. Gwen Ifill is a journalist, television newscaster, and author. She is the moderator and managing editor of Washington Week and co-anchor and co-managing editor with Judy Woodruff on PBS NewsHour, both of which air on PBS. She is a political analyst and moderated the 2004 and 2008 vice presidential debates. She is the author of the book, The Breakthrough: Politics and Race in the Age of Obama. Please welcome to the stage Judith Rodin and Gwen Ifill for a discussion on Judith's book.
Microphones. Oh. Hello, everybody. Hi. You're just here to get out of the rain, aren't you? Hello, Judy.
Hi, Gwen.
I'm going to start by asking you just a very basic question for people who haven't been fortunate enough to read this book yet. What is resilience?
Well, our introducer talked about crisis as the new normal, and it surely is. Somewhere in the world, at least once a week, there's a storm or a new epidemic people hadn't heard about 6 months before, civil unrest, a cyber attack. And in this age of so much unpredictability and so much turmoil, resilience is about developing three capacities: the capacity to be ready, to prepare for any kind of disruption, the capacity to respond, that is, to respond in ways that allow you to bounce back more quickly and more effectively if there is a disruption, and the capacity to revitalize so that if there is a blow, you really are developing the opportunity to revitalize, adapt, and change. We need to shift our paradigm, and so we are very much focused now in the United States and around the world on relief and recovery, and not enough on preparedness and readiness. And let me tell you just one short story, and I think it will make the point about preparedness. Boston, for at least 6 or 7 years, had been rehearsing for something to go wrong, whether it was a terrorist attack or a violent storm or flooding. They didn't know what it would be, and of course none of us know what it will be. So this is about readiness for any kind of disruption, makes you better ready for every disruption.
In Boston's case, it was about the Boston Marathon bombing,
Right.
something which, even though you say they were preparing, for some reason, that kind of disruption, you're still completely unprepared.
But they brought together all the elements of government. They brought together communications companies and water companies and transit companies and all of the medical responders precisely because they didn't know what it was. And they had a plan so that they really knew who was on first. They had already decided that no matter what happened, if there was a crisis, Governor Patrick would be the communicator. They had already decided no matter what kind of crisis it would be, the FBI was going to be the coordinator. In 19 minutes, anybody who had been hurt got to a hospital and no one died. They used every event that was occurring in Boston as a chance to rehearse. 4th of July events, sporting teams who won and had big parades, so that they were unbelievably ready. We see this in businesses too. For example, Walmart has the goal of increasing their on-site renewable energy by 600% by 2020 because they are preparing for any kind of disruption, whether it's a natural or a man-made disaster, they will be ready.
Well, now think about the word resiliency. I think about it as bouncing back. Does this mean that it always has to be a disaster involved?
No, because obviously this is about planning in case something goes wrong. The idea here is that not every disruption has to become a disaster. The dividend that I talk about is really the investment in preparedness that pays off whether or not something goes wrong, and that's the ambition. Whether you're an individual thinking about your own resilience or lead a company or a member of a community or lead a city, there are dividends that pay off for these kinds of preparedness investments. For example, we're worried about the economy. There are all kinds of amazing new goods and services by taking a resilience framework. The Internet of Things, sensing mechanisms, one characteristic of a greater resiliency is greater awareness, the capacity to really take in information. So there are all kinds of really good investments. I'll give you another example. Hoboken, a city we worked with in the Sandy Commission, had for years real problems with regard to green recreational space, problem with regard to flooding, which was their big problem in Sandy, but also very little parking in downtown Hoboken. What we're doing in Hoboken now is building underground parking. The surface level will be green space with great recreation, bike paths, running trails. The parking will be garages, and it's engineered with a new Dutch technology that will allow those parking garages to be water containment overflow tanks in case of flooding. So 3 wins for 1 investment. That's the resilience dividend.
You have one example in the book which compares, and it also involves Superstorm Sandy, in which an IKEA, which was built new and from scratch, survived the flooding and the destruction, while a Fairway supermarket did not because of planning.
Exactly. So IKEA was very well prepared. They knew that they were close to a coastline, and often they locate in sites like that around the world because they want to be in places that are attractive and will draw clientele. But their buildings are all built with the parking at the ground level and the showrooms at the middle level and then the storage at the top level, and they always put their generators in the middle. So they had very little flooding, and the dividend for them was that they became the community resource center very quickly because they recovered so quickly. So it's where food and supplies were given out. And we looked at their sales a year later, a year after Sandy, and it was really clear that the dividend for them is that they had been viewed by the community as such a resource that they were no longer sort of suspected as that big box kind of entity. They are a community resource, and they maintain that going forward.
So much of the disasters or the disruptions that you write about in the book have to do with water, and I think of Katrina. That's a case in which we would be hard put to say that that city, that New Orleans, that the Gulf Coast was terribly resilient or prepared.
So that takes us to the second and third phases of building resilience, how you recover and then how you adapt and grow. It is very clear that New Orleans was completely unprepared, and our work at the Rockefeller Foundation actually began because we intervened and helped New Orleans build back after Katrina by helping them to develop their recovery plan. Walter Isaacson was just here. He was co-chairing the Louisiana Recovery Authority and brought us into it. So we were there very early, and we saw how dysfunctional their preparation was. But think about all of the elements that made them dysfunctional: a great deal of poverty, having housing in areas that were totally vulnerable to floodplains, even if the levees had not broken, very dysfunctional city government, and very high rates of crime. It'll be 10 years next year since Katrina, and I was in New Orleans a couple weeks ago, and they used their recovery to revitalize in the most profound and really elegant way. They took over all their public schools, and the school children's performance now is truly extraordinary. They completely diversified their economy. Diversity is such an important component of resilience because it gives you strength. And so they now have been rated by Forbes magazine and Inc. As a really cool startup innovation place, and they continue to do that. And finally, they directly focused, as they rebuilt communities, on how to build community cohesiveness, more trusting communities, communities that trusted one another, and communities that trusted their government.
When you talk, I want to get back to the government part. When you talk about diversity, you have a different definition that would leap to mind for many people when they talk about diversity.
So it is both, actually. One of the elements of resiliency is diversity, and typically we think about that as redundancy, and redundancy is critical. I'll give you another example from the book, and that is many people will remember the debacle of Lululemon's yoga pants in 2011 when they were so unbelievably sheer. Well, they lost $2 billion of market cap, and they had many, many lawsuits, and of course, lost consumer confidence. What was wrong is that they were relying on a single manufacturer for a single source of that fabric from a single kind of fiber. So redundancy in that sense is really very critical, but it also is diversity. And as we've looked at the communities that flourish, even in the face of adversity, and those that do not, often those that are more diverse, have more different kinds of resources to call upon, actually do better. So diversity is a key feature of resilience.
Is disruption ever ultimately a good thing? Unprepared for disruption?
No, unprepared for disruption is not good, because then it often does become a disaster. But a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, as that sounds. And so when there is a disruption, it is important to be able to utilize it effectively. We have a very strong tendency in the United States, because of our legislative regulations after recoveries, but also I think human nature pushes for this, to try to get things back to normal. We all want it to feel the same as quickly as possible. It can't be the same, or you are decreasing the opportunity to build resilience, because there is something in what was the same that made you vulnerable. And so we need to use those moments to rebuild more safely and more effectively, whether it's a personal disruption or crisis, or one that hits our communities, our cities, or our businesses.
What if it's a different kind of disruption, not a natural disaster, but a disaster of disease, like we were watching Ebola unfold in West Africa, or bird flu fears, or whatever this year's disease is? How do you prepare for something that you've never even seen before?
There are 5 characteristics of building resilience. So developing the capacity to really be aware, to understand what's going on in the situation, and then be able to respond to it quickly and effectively. The second is redundancy, so making sure that you have fallback. And that's important even if there's not a crisis. We all want to develop a thoughtful set of redundant capacities so that we're not relying on a single thing to succeed. The third element is integration. Do we really have, across all of our systems, transparency and integration that will allow us to know what's going on? The fourth is a critical one, self-regulation. We need to be able to separate out something that goes down when it does. So in New York, a single generator failure took down the electricity of all of Lower Manhattan. We are rebuilding back in New York with smart switch technology so that you actually can island or de-network that which is failing so that it doesn't take everything down. That's a very important capacity that you should and could build in. And then the final one is adaptability. How adaptable are you as an individual? How adaptable do you think your city is or your business? Being able, that's a great quality. So these 5 characteristics put you in very good stead in good times, and therefore allow this. We can never know. We are living in an unpredictable world, so we can never know what the next thing will be that will hit.
But it doesn't sound applicable in a community. It doesn't have the basic infrastructure that even exists to begin to understand, to have a hospital, to have a trained doctor, to have roads that will get you to Monrovia if you need to.
You know, we work so much in Africa and do a variety of resilience building health programs, and I would argue that equally poor countries in West Africa did better. So the Democratic Republic of the Congo did better. Senegal did better, not equally poor, but Senegal did better. And it was because they have the ability to call on whatever capacity they had more effectively. They had more integrated systems. They had far greater adaptability. We saw in Monrovia, even if they had health clinics, one health clinic didn't know what a group a mile away was doing in another health clinic, and that was true in how they were testing the communications patterns of people who were infected. So they were non-resilient, not because they were poor, but because they had not built these 5 characteristics into their capacity.
Well, here's another example. In Japan, as far away from the world as you can get from West Africa, the Fukushima disaster was, ultimately, they said it was a man-made, let me start this sentence again. The Fukushima disaster ultimately was conceded to be a disaster made in Japan because of layers and layers of problems which violated all of your 5 tenets.
Well, I talk about Fukushima and analyze it deeply in the book because they had, for the first time, a post-situation commission. It's the first time in the history of modern Japan that they have ever been willing to publicly analyze what went wrong. So there's a wealth of data. And part of it they absolutely attribute to their culture, the culture of acquiescing, the culture of not being willing to call out something that goes wrong, the culture of not being able to be adaptable and flexible. The Prime Minister of Japan then went to the Fukushima plant and started calling out rules and regulations and orders for the people. Unfortunately, a lot of the workers didn't follow him, which is so counter to Japanese culture. You know, and I contrast that to the leadership that Governor Patrick showed after the marathon bombings, because they rehearsed that all he was supposed to do was be the communicator in chief, and that's all he did. He didn't go to the site, he didn't go to the hospitals, he kept digital wildfires from spreading rumors, because he exercised his leadership effectively. But there's a positive example from Japan, and I think it really does show the benefit of entities that did have all 5 characteristics. So if you take Toyota lost almost 700 plants, either because of the earthquake or flooding or fires that occurred in the aftermath, and 370,000 cars. So they slipped from #1 car producer in the world to #4. But Toyota has this amazing culture and something that they call the Toyota production system, which in the good times really enables all of their employees to be entrepreneurial, to make suggestions about new ways to make the products better, to communicate with one another. They have a lot of redundancy in their systems. They didn't fall prey to the business guru logic of only real-time production or trying to pare down. And so they had all 5 characteristics. They rebounded very quickly, and they revitalized. Lots of new models of cars came out of that crisis, new kinds of paints and dyes that they invented because their dye producers were gone offline for so long. And 2 years later, while Japan is still reeling economically, Toyota is again the #1 car producer.
But isn't it a natural human instinct to not want to acknowledge risk, let alone plan for it?
I'm a psychologist, and so I got interested in this idea early in my career. And I would argue that we need to acknowledge potential risk or potential failure in order to cope better, and that's something we need to teach our children to do more effectively. It's really easy to learn how to succeed. It's harder to learn how to fail. And part of resilience building is learning how to fail safely and not catastrophically, whether you're a person or a city or a business. That's, in a way, what this is really all about. So we are building core elements of strength when we are building resilience in people, in institutions, and in our cities.
Let's talk about institutions, because you mentioned earlier about the challenges of government or political will, whatever term you want to apply to this. Does the solution always have to start with government, or does it do better in the private sector?
Well, I think it's all of the above, and I would add to your list community-based organizations. So the wonderful thing about building resilience is that you need leadership on the top, whether it's government or city or federal government, but you also need leadership from the bottom. And so I tell a story that I love so much in the book about the Rockaway Surf Club. These are a group of surfers who met on one of the beaches, and they had a little surf kind of clubhouse. And the community members were sort of nervous about them. They looked like surfers. They were kind of scruffy in these communities. And when the storms hit, they were among the first responders. And often your first responders are not the police or the firemen because they don't get there quickly enough. It's your neighbors, the people down the street. And so now they're integrated into the fabric of the community in such a phenomenal way. And so leadership emerges, and that's a really powerful thing. It's not only the appointed or elected leaders that are important at these moments, and the benefit of that for the ongoing sense of community that we've been seeing around the world is really phenomenal.
Well, here's the thing, though, as you well know, and I don't want to get you in trouble here, but government doesn't always work.
Really?
I just heard this, and that sometimes politics doesn't work. And sometimes the basic problem isn't acknowledged. And I think of the climate change argument, which we continue to have around the world, not just in Washington. And I wonder, how do you circumnavigate that to apply these principles?
Well, I did a congressional briefing on the Hill on Thursday around this, and as I said to members, and there were both Republicans and Democrats there, these crises hit Republican and Democratic communities alike in the United States. There's no Republican hurricane and Democratic flood. And so this could be an issue that they really could agree to. They're also looking for very critical ways to get more bang for the taxpayer buck. The Hoboken example, many, many others that I give in the book are about having multiple wins for the investment. We have spent in the United States in the last 2 years $150 billion on disaster recovery alone. Now that's $400 a household. FEMA estimates that for every dollar invested in resilience building, we save $4 in disaster recovery spend. It seems to me it's a very sensible argument to make to Congress. But as I said, often their legislation starts with a build back the same mandate. So some of you may be from Vermont. Vermont had incredible flooding, horrible rainfall in 2011 for 2 days. And they rebuilt their culverts to respond to the fact that this kind of flooding may be the new normal. And so they built them back way better than they had been before. FEMA can't reimburse them because the mandate from the Stafford Act was they can only reimburse building it back the same way it was. Now that's nutty. So we've got to figure out how not only the mindset has to change, but our legislative actions have to change. And as I said to them, it's not new spend. So they're about to authorize a new transportation bill, a new highway bill. There are more or less resilient ways to build highways. We now have building materials that absorb water more quickly and release it more slowly. We have pilings that are made from 3D printing that bend with wave action rather than breaking. Bend rather than break is an adaptive characteristic of resilience. So for the same spend, why don't we just do it in a resilient way?
We have questions from the audience, but before we turn to them, and if you have questions, please feel free. I want to, I guess after having been steeped in this subject, and as you mentioned, talking to lawmakers, talking to corporate titans, talking to community leaders, do you come away optimistic that they hear this message, or pessimistic that it's going to take a while?
I'm incredibly optimistic because so much of our work is with government officials closer to the ground, mayors and governors, and they really get it. Whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents, they have to prepare their citizens, they have to deliver services every day, and we see mayors and governors across the United States and indeed across the world who really understand this and are building. We have mayor, and one quick story before we go, because this isn't only about having the capacity to do better if a shock hits. This is also about doing better in the slow-burning stresses that are affecting all of our communities, whether it's inequality or poor air quality, bad transportation options and the like, and they build more slowly, but they stress our capacities as well. And an example that I give in the book is Medellin, Colombia, which for years and years was known as the drug capital of the world and had one of the highest crime rates in the world. And they were fighting it with policing and military and all of the traditional things that are used. They recognized, though, that maybe the problem was actually their topography. It is a city built at the flat part, and all of the middle class and economic value is there. But all of the poor people are in favelas dotting the hills. And they were the ones being controlled by the drug lords, and they were the ones who were the mules running drugs and the like. And they were completely disconnected physically from the heart of the community. So Medellin built a transit system with a metro on the floor of the valley, but then gondolas, like we see in ski resorts, as part of their transit system going to the communities. And in the communities that they couldn't reach by the gondolas, they built escalators into the hills. And at every gondola stop and every escalator stop, they put a health clinic, a primary school, or a child care center. And so now, 10 years later, crime is down 90%. Medellin is a tourist attraction. Talk about a resilience dividend, great social cohesion. It's an amazing story.
We have time for questions. So why don't you go to the microphone so we can hear you speak, and we would love to take them, as many as we can squeeze in. If you don't mind telling us who you are and where you're from, that'd be great. Thank you.
I'm Richard Asher. My question is, we have a ticking time bomb across this country with our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges. Look what happened in Kansas City with that bridge collapse. Now, I know you touched on it a little bit about the roads having more moisture, but how can you deal with that in the area that you're talking about?
We've worked very hard, and I give lots of examples in the book, but basically it is the case that infrastructure investment yields dividends before anything bad happens. So not only does it improve the infrastructure, obviously, but where there is good infrastructure, there's often better transit options, and then housing develops and commercial sites develop. So it is a win for that investment. We are showing that if the federal government won't act here, there are ways for the states to aggregate and create state-run infrastructure investment banks. We created one in New York after Sandy, and it allows you to bring in private capital. There's a lot of private investment for infrastructure sitting on the sidelines, waiting for government to act. So we've been very active in helping some of that money help municipalities. Boulder, after their flooding, rebuilt an amazing plan that doesn't only protect the flooding, but built bicycle paths and new transit routes, all as part of the flooding control system in their infrastructure, and it's all being funded by private developers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, my name is David Alexander, and you have spoken about resilience in the mass, sort of in a mass level, government at large. For me, resilience also involves personal resilience, and many of the steps that you mentioned are also steps on a personal level. There is another presentation that will be made tomorrow by a woman by the name of Rebecca Alexander, who Gwen is Peter Alexander of NBC and MSNBC's sister, who is very accomplished. She has a retinal degenerative disease in which she's losing her vision and her hearing. And the book is Not Fade Away. And she talks about what's necessary for personal resilience, which is not to look back and
Can I ask you,
reach out.
I'm
My
sorry.
question is, have you read
Yeah,
it, and could you
thank you.
comment about personal resilience?
Yes, as I said, I'm a psychologist, and so my journey in thinking about resilience started there. And of course, people who have faced the kind of adversity that you talk about are important narrators about resilience. My effort is really to create in all of us more resilient people so that we don't have to build it only after we face adversity.
Yeah,
and there are numerous personal examples in this book that really do reflect heroic individuals both preparing and responding effectively. But thank you.
She's a
Thank
psychotherapist
you, sir.
also.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this lecture. My name is Alex DiCarvalho. I'm the Knight Foundation Innovator in Residence at Florida International University. And my question is, whenever there's a disaster, social media plays an increasing role. There's all kinds of social media activity. What are your thoughts on building resilience through social and digital media?
Well, I think social media, and again, I talk about several examples in the book, can play a positive role or a negative role. So in the Boston example and many others we saw, there was a need to be able to communicate effectively and quickly so that social media didn't spread digital rumors in ways that really prevent people responding as effectively. And so that's the downside of social media. The positive side is that we've seen all over the world that often social media is the canary in the coal mine, that you can see a problem emerging. In the health example that Gwen asked about, they didn't have very effective social media there where some of the other countries did. And so they didn't have the kinds of early warning signs. We built a disease surveillance network in the Mekong region, Rockefeller, after the SARS outbreak. And part of that is relying very deeply on social media as early detection units and early warning units. So good things and bad things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
Hello, I'm Carolina Jayaram. I'm the CEO of United States Artists, an organization that you helped found.
Thank you.
And now, having worked with artists for so many years, I believe that they exhibit so many of the characteristics that you speak of in terms of their ability to bounce back from failure and resiliency and redundancy. And I'm curious to know, in the many studies that you've done for this book and examples that you cite, were there examples where creative people or artists were called upon or came forth in ways that helped bring greater resiliency or response to some of these examples that you gave?
Yes, one of the great recovery and revitalization examples is the city of Glasgow in Scotland, and they were kind of down and out and a manufacturing town like Detroit, and they have revitalized and rebuilt almost entirely on developing the arts, bringing more creative people in, and seeing the kind of innovation and revitalization that occurs when artists are infusing their energy and creativity into a community. I think some of you know that when I was president of the University of Pennsylvania, we worked very closely to reanimate and re-energize a very disadvantaged community on our doorstep. And one of the first things that we did as we were working on economic revitalization and fixing the schools was we gave free space to artists, because we knew if artists came into the community, their energy and their creativity would help in the revitalization process. And then finally, I was just in Medellin in February, and one of the things that's so interesting now is that when you go to the tops of the hills to take a gondola down or one of the escalators down, you see that the people have now decorated all of the elements of the hills. They've all become artists on their own because they're expressing creativity and imagination and inclusion in a way that they didn't feel before. And so it's so beautiful to watch that kind of response.
I have a deal for you. There are 3 more people behind you. I'm sorry. And if each of you can ask us really tight questions and tight answers,
Okay.
Judy, we can get them all in.
I'm Roger Bernstein from Miami. Speak to the refugee flow around the world, specifically Syria and the burden on Jordan, on Turkey, on Lebanon. Where's the resilience? How do you prepare for that?
Rockefeller has an initiative we launched in our centennial called 100 Resilient Cities, and I have to tell you that reading the applications, we've had 800 applications from cities around the world, and reading the applications from many of those cities who are receiving so many of those refugees and are completely burdened in terms of their own population, their physical resources, their energy resources. There are some cities that are more resilient. They weren't prepared for refugees, but they have more adaptive capacities, and other cities that I think are completely going to go down as a result of the refugee overflow. So a story being written.
Priscilla Dames, I work a lot with professionals to deal with youth. You said part of building resiliency is learning how to fail successfully. I love that. Could you talk a little bit about the youth and building resiliency through the parents and educators?
Yes, absolutely. I think that we really do need to redefine what skills our education system is trying to train for. Walter talked eloquently in the last session about science and math and humanities and all of those. Obviously, I'm an educator, and I believe that all of those are critical. But we need to teach our children how to cope successfully, how to fail more safely, how to draw outside the lines, not just draw inside the lines. Our education system is often focused on learning how to draw inside the lines. And I think that now, I hope through this book, through other books, that educators, particularly in K through 12, will be thinking about that, because we are losing our innovation capacity and that edge. We pride ourselves on Silicon Valley, and obviously we still are an amazingly innovative and entrepreneurial country, but we could help our children to learn how to be better innovators and be more resilient.
I appreciate you continuing to go back to Sandy.
Failing successfully has really got to be another definition of resilience. They're giving me the cut, but I promised you the last question, sir.
Hi, Judith. Bob Diamond from Boca Raton. First, I wanted to say hello. I was in your class at NYU.
Hi.
Uptown, your psychology class a million years ago.
She was a baby when she taught it.
Right.
It was my first year.
I was older than the teacher, I'm sure. So anyway, I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I just wanted to ask you what jurisdictions or states have really adopted some of these principles ahead of some of the others.
We see San Francisco is amazing in terms of their degree of resilience, and they are both preparing, but they've recovered from, they used the Loma Pietra earthquake as really a way to start building a different San Francisco.
Right? Bayshare.
Yeah, Bayshare, the Lifelines Council, they have all elements, whether it's communications, electricity, government, are integrated in their planning process. And now they've adapted, because they, of course, are the home of Airbnb and Uber and the sharing economy. And excess capacity is another resilience feature, so they've built that in. They use Fleet Week, which used to be a kind of bar crawl for the Navy. It's now used to train all their citizens on readiness and preparedness exercises. It's really amazing what they're doing. So we see lots of that, both in the United States and around the world. And obviously we think of the Dutch as being quite resilient, but they're doing it through hard infrastructure. And I think what our work has shown is that in this day and age, when we worry about climate change and other issues, green infrastructure is a piece of this solution. It's much less expensive, environmentally, of course, much more protective, and builds a new framework for the 21st century.
Judith Rodin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gwen.
And thank you all.
Let's thank both of our authors again.